My name is Hannah Brancato, and I am a part of Force Upsetting Rape Culture, an artist activist collective to upset the culture of rape and promote a culture of consent. And my collaborator is Rebecca Nagel. So what we do is a series of actions, events, and we make images that basically capture the public's imagination, as one of the writers who's covered our work said, and help people to envision what a world without rape would look like and what a culture of consent could look like. So in each of the actions, we're sort of modeling what that could be. So for example, a project that I think increased knowledge, all of the work actually does increase knowledge and change attitudes, but I'll talk specifically about how Pink Loves Consent I think promoted knowledge. So in Pink Loves Consent, we pretended to be Victoria's Secret, promoting a line of consent-themed underwear. We produced a fake website. We had a photo shoot with models of all different shapes and sizes, wearing this consent-themed underwear, saying things like no means no and ask first. And we contrasted that with the underwear that Pink by Victoria's Secret sells, which says things like sure thing and uses no as a way to flirt in their slogans. And so by producing this website, we were talking specifically to the audience of consumers that would be buying Victoria's Secret underwear and might not on the surface be interested in talking about consent. But what we found is that by opening people up to the idea through a marketing campaign that seemed lighter than necessarily a public health message, we were able to educate people about what consent really was and the fact that it was meant to be about better sex as opposed to about something that didn't seem as fun. So that's an example of, I think, so by the end of the campaign, we were able to have a Twitter following. People were talking about consent online, millions of people. Who knows, it was hard to track by the time we were done with it. And even to this day, like, we still hear people talking about consent underwear, and I think some of that buzz kind of came from, the campaign. We also aligned it with the Victoria's Secret fashion show when, we basically had people tweeting at Victoria's Secret that as a, corporation that's promoting and owning in a lot of ways like women's sexuality, that they should be selling a better idea of what sex could look like in a better world. So so that was an educational campaign, and we also we do actions like that, but we also do workshops where we actually teach people in high school and college settings about what consent is, and practice how to communicate with your partners. We like having these media grabbing actions that are spectacular in a way, and we think that that's what really gets people's attention. But what we like about doing the education after is that it's a nice follow-up, and it's also a way to sustain the conversation so that we're planting the seed, and then it creates a level where people can go a little bit deeper with it. Because with Pink Loves Consent, some people just saw the underwear that said ask first, and maybe walked away from that thinking Victoria's Secret actually made that underwear, which is actually okay. Like, that's okay for people, because then you're envisioning that world. But when you realize that it was a prank, and then maybe get into a little bit of a deeper understanding of it, and you're able to think about what consent really looks like, and does underwear actually stop rape? No, right? It's meant to be a reminder to have a verbal conversation, right? And so then when people get into those conversations, or can have workshops, or even just have dialogue with their peer groups, I think it just kind of makes the information sink in on another level. So one of the main things that we are working on, so it's Force Upsetting Rape Culture, right? So the work is all about changing values and attitudes. It's all about the fact that we can change policies, and actually the definition of rape did change in the past couple of years to, first of all, speak to consent, and also to include all genders, which is really significant because prior to this change, the definition of rape didn't include men, and didn't, and it talked about forcible rape, and it wasn't about, giving consent and the idea that when you're quiet, you can't give consent. So that changed, that law changed, but what does it take for people to also, as a culture, believe that, that rape should be defined not by how forcible it was, but by whether or not consent was given. So the way that we like to do that is by thinking about the media and thinking about the visual messaging that we're given all the time and that we might not stop to think about. And so in the images that we create, what we want to do is have this moment where we're presenting something that's familiar, but then just shifting it slightly so that people can have a new understanding. So, for example, with the Monument Project, this is a series of temporary monuments that we're putting on the National Mall to propose that there should be a permanent monument to survivors of rape and abuse. And the reason that we're making temporary monuments is that we think that we live in a culture that shames and silences survivors, and that a physical public space is one way to change that. Another thing that needs to change is the way that the media covers rape, and the way that the media still centers their coverage on perpetrators and not on survivors, right? So by creating this like public supportive space, we think that we're building, we're building awareness and changing the culture towards that end. So for example, next summer, we're going to install a giant picnic blanket on the National Mall in the style of the AIDS quilt. And it's going to be made up of survivor stories, so 5x7 picnic blankets that are sent in to us, made by survivors, by groups, and workshops by individuals. And those blankets will be assembled into a giant statement that spells messages that our culture, our media, friends and supporters, allies, should be giving to survivors. We are not alone, we will be heard. Our trauma is not our fault. And so that's an example of, the way that our work is changing attitudes. I love that idea of interrupting, and we definitely think about culture jamming, that all of these things are creating like a disruption and a moment of literally a shift of perspective, right? So I'm gonna answer another question, which is like so that perspective shift is actually fundamentally what art should be, right? That it's literally like a window into another person's understanding of the world, right? At its most basic, I think that's what art can be. And then the other thing that art can do is that it can create new experiences. And so as an artist, like the potential that I've seen and that within Force we've been able to put into practice, where that perspective shift can actually build towards social justice, is that people become very comfortable with the way that things are and begin to accept them as natural or normal or inevitable. And especially with rape culture, rape becomes something that people think of as impossible to end, and something that's always happened, and something that's never going to change no matter what we do. And so, social justice ultimately, to me, is first getting people into a place where they realize that the inequity that exists doesn't have to exist, and that actually people can organize to change it and do something about it. So it's sort of like understanding that things can change, and then understanding that people actually have the power to change it.